Nananiha. So my name is, they call me Sammy Matsaw Jr. I'm an enrolled member of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. I say Sandavi, so I don't know where anybody is in their day right now. So I'll just say good day, not good morning or good evening. I was raised in a salmon-based culture, and throughout my life, I've been challenged in this story of sort of my origins, at least with that, and seeing my father catch a salmon.
Welcome back to On the Move, a podcast mini-series about wild animals, their amazing migrations, and how people are finding ways to free them up from all the things standing in their way. I'm Leah Palmer, a storyteller at the Nature Conservancy. You've been listening to Sammy Matsaw Jr., director of the Columbia Basin Salmon Program at TNC. In this episode, you'll hear from Sammy and other experts whose work supports the complex migrations salmon make, and who are helping to ensure these incredible species persist for generations to come.
My first experience was seeing a salmon caught in a small stream in central Idaho and just not believing the story. And so for me to witness that and see a large fish, like a massive fish coming out of these small streams where I knew you could take their trout, but to see that big fish come out was really the origins of me understanding what that means for us as a people, as we take that food and we celebrate it and we eat it. And there's a lot of storytelling that's around that for us as a people. In my own personal experience, is how does that expand out larger into my academic pursuits in college and also my pursuits as a profession as a salmon ecologist. And now as a Indigenous leader within the Nature Conservancy, leading the Columbia Basin Salmon Program. Salmon were scarce. They were really at a downfall. There was a deficit of salmon. And so, and there has been since then. It's just, we've had some good years, but mostly bad years. And that was a bad year. We would go out with our spear poles. So we have these long spear poles that we hunt salmon with. And the back ends of them, you'll use them to push them under the banks to see if there's a fish hiding under there. Because during the day, they hide under the banks or they hide in log jams. And we got to a hole, and there was a salmon in there that my uncle found. And he calls my dad over to get it. And my dad spears it and pulls it out. But after walking in the stream all day in July, it seemed like a lot of work to get one fish. And so to see my dad pull that one fish out after we spent all that work through the day looking for a fish, it meant a lot. I could feel that. I felt that amongst our relatives that were there and our family. My dad was to feel really proud of himself that we finally got a fish. And it ended like that was it. We knew we had enough. Like, there's fish in there. We could have found some more. We could have kept going. It was just the one fish that we carried to our camp, and we enjoyed that fish. So to me, it felt like the resource was being held in a way that, as I understood later, was that we take what we need and no more. And so that one fish, like being able to share that with everybody and make sure everybody had some to eat, it felt very special. It felt really, the idea of like sacred. It felt like something sacred, like we were honoring this animal by making sure we remember our culture and our way of life through our mouth and the ways that we bring food into our ceremonies and our life and our bodies. But also just to carry that on, to know that there's more fish out there, we could go get them, but we're not going to do that. We just want this one fish just to make sure the culture continues on. That was important to me.
How old were you then?
I was about 9, 10 years old, somewhere around there. I think 4th to 5th grade. I was around in that range. Yeah.
Sammy holds a PhD in water resource science and management from the University of Idaho in Moscow. He is a combat veteran who saw deployments in Iraq as an infantry team leader and sergeant. Throughout his career, he served as a research scientist for the Shoshone-Bannock Fish and Wildlife Department, and also as a tribal leader on the Fort Hall Business Council. His work at TNC comes at a critical time for salmon in the Columbia River Basin, which are now on the verge of extinction. This basin spans over 250,000 square miles in British Columbia, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. Historically, the basin was known for its abundant salmon runs, reaching an estimated 16 million fish in the rivers and streams annually. In this region, salmon are inextricably linked to economic well-being, healthy forests, rivers, and ocean ecosystems. Their migrations have sustained industry, recreation, rural communities, and thriving indigenous cultures for millennia. So much so that many indigenous people in the Pacific Northwest consider themselves salmon people. But in the early 1900s, we see a rise in human impact on the land and waters where salmon migrate. Humans built affordable and low-emission hydropower, new transportation infrastructure, and irrigation technology for agriculture. This innovation came at a significant cost to salmon. Today, salmon habitats are degraded and disconnected, with studies confirming we're running out of time to save the species in the Columbia Basin. I sat down with Sammy to find out what it means to be part of a salmon-based culture and to explore his strategy to salmon recovery. I found his approach isn't only about removing physical barriers to their migration. It's about removing relational barriers that divide recreational river users, rural communities, industries, and salmon people. These groups haven't always agreed on the best path forward for salmon. The good news is that despite sometimes clashing worldviews, these parties have one thing in common. This is a species none of us can afford to lose. Before we explore these clashing worldviews, I think it's important for listeners to know what a healthy salmon migration looks like and how these fish became a cultural icon. Here's more from our conversation.
So a salmon is born in a small stream, high in the mountains usually, cold, clean water. The mother buries the eggs in gravel, like a nest, to protect it. Inside of that gravel bed, it's taking a yolk sac and it's eating that. And once that yolk sac disappears, it starts eating on its own and it emerges from that gravel and starts gathering its own food. Stays in the stream for a year to 2 years as it's starting to move out to the ocean. It goes through like a smolting, what they call it. And that high amount of hormones going through its body helps it imprint on where it returns back to. So it stresses every time it goes into a new water system that it doesn't recognize through its nose and its eyes and its ears and its sensories. It spikes in hormones that then imprints on it where it was from. And so when it goes out to the ocean and gathers all of this food, gets really big, comes back as an adult, it goes back to that imprinting as a map and has its own way of unfolding the story of how it was born and brought into the world. Goes back to usually within that same stream it was born in and reproduces itself and starts the process all over again.
How does this process and its repetition over time form culture?
For indigenous peoples, if you look at the stability of their knowledge systems and how much they grew. So our knowledge system has all of these teachings in them and governance and science and the things that we hold dear in any society. And that gets reflected in art, in regalia, in customs, protocols, traditions. And so all of that stability and how those societies are structured really comes from that salmon-based culture. This very special animal as its behavior. We explain it in biology or in the sciences that the life history. So that knowledge system that comes from observing that behavior becomes really seminal to the complexity of the governance and all the things that I mentioned earlier.
So what worldview clashes with the indigenous knowledge system Sammy is describing? And how has this clash impacted salmon? Well, according to Sammy, this is best understood when you look at language structures.
most indigenous languages are based in verbs, so thousands of verbs and less than 1,000 nouns, whereas the English language that we currently speak through is thousands of nouns and less than 1,000 verbs.
Sammy explains that noun-based language systems, like modern English, value what a thing is in contrast to another thing, whereas verb-based languages, like what's spoken by Salmon People, tend to value a thing not for what it is, but for what it does, its unique relationship to the people and world around it.
The real focus is on like behaviors of things, like how do these things move? How are they connected? That's why relationality and relationships becomes the basis of our knowledge systems. Like how does relationality really start to shape the way that we're networking within that seasonal realm throughout time?
Sammy says that when noun-based languages first settled in the Americas, the course of salmon migrations along the Columbia River Basin was fundamentally changed. Dams and other infrastructure became new barriers to successful salmon runs.
So we're in this point, right? We've had colonialism for the last 500 years. Since then, there's been this impact between a noun and a verb thought world. Specifically under that larger umbrella, as we see barriers to movement for big animals like salmon or bison being able to move across large landscapes. So salmon that are now born in those small streams here in central Idaho have to go through 8 dams to go out to the ocean and then return through those 8 dams back as adults. So 16 dams that they have to go through. Each time they come to a dam, their mortality reduces. So a female will have up to 4,500 eggs, but the survivability is lower than replacement.
Wow.
Because of those dams. Yeah, because of those dams, we have very, very, very low numbers. Actually, we're trending towards extinction.
So if part of Sammy's work is to advocate for removing these barriers to salmon migration, his conversations begin with understanding the deeper reasons behind their presence on the landscape.
So it feels like where we're at now in the 21st century is we're starting to understand these two different thought worlds and how they touch. And can we actually review some of these barriers and say, are they really delivering the things that are desired? Does it really help with flood control? Does it help with energy production? Does it help with agriculture? And if it doesn't, and we can actually reduce some of these barriers and also have salmon, it seems to make sense that some of these barriers should be considered for removal. Because it was at a time, right? It was at a time of great American idealistic expansion, these artifacts and histories of moving manifest destiny forward. So you have these monuments to that. But I realize that there's a cultural connection from, white settlers as they view those. There's a cultural connection to those. It's a reflection of their grandfathers and the people before them. And to remove them is like, it's the same impacts we felt as those dams went in. We seen our cultural artifacts go underneath the water of those dams. So we're now at a place where we're trying to understand, like, how do we recognize and honor both cultures? We can talk about all the desired sort of outcomes from what a dam does, but I think it's the history that underlies that makes people feel nostalgia, sentiment. And those are big human issues about what I talk about is what are real barriers, and sort of joke around about which day you wear your sweats on. We joke around, me and my wife, like there's that scene in Mean Girls where they're at lunch and that Regina's wearing her sweats. And it's like, you're not wearing sweats today. She's like, I just made that rule up.
It's Wednesday.
Yep.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's arbitrary.
Some of it can be very arbitrary. Yeah, the nitty gritty is that we have centuries of sidestepping the sovereignty of tribes. More importantly, the supreme law of the land, treaty rights. And that kind of governance being sidestepped is just that. It's a disconnect from nature, because that connection to nature is a governance of nature. It's a governance that holds hands with nature. And so trying to undo some of those systemic issues that come up that are rooted in really difficult topics to deal with that are triggers for people. We understand that there are triggers, and we need to continue to engage in them and be comfortable in the discomfort so that we can get to points of equity rather than resolution. Because resolution is just to quell the discomfort. It's not necessarily to really have deeper discussions about equity. And so having those stories over and over and actually working through them and getting us to a place where people aren't afraid or fearful of nature or even having a relationship with indigenous peoples really gets us into a place where we can reshape policy, because that's the permeable part where things become really real and dams get put in place. But it's also the place where things can happen where dams can get removed. But there's a culture that undergirds that policy for us to understand and start to negotiate with that really puts us in a place where we talk about equity in real meaningful ways that not only benefits tribes, but their neighboring communities. And so I would hope that as we think about doing that kind of work together and having those uncomfortable conversations, that there's a goal in mind. It's not that I'm just in here to be beat on or hear triggering language or feel like, I'm the bad guy. I don't think it's about bad guys or good guys. It's about the human experience and where we are in our history and how we understand that now. And what does it mean for future generations and our children? If we say those things are important, those two things are young people, which give us hope, and the lands that we live upon that we see beauty in. As neighbors, need to really think realistically about what do we want for the places that we call home. And really importantly, thinking about the places that we call home, the places where we step out the door and we feel a sense of belonging. We feel a sense of holding a salmon on a stream bank and bringing that home to our dinner tables and sharing that with our families. I think that commonality in that thread about belonging through that kind of animal connection and connection to nature and a connection to a place when you step out the door, you say, this place is so beautiful. Why would I want to ruin this?
Support comes from the Nature Conservancy. In the Columbia River Basin of the Pacific Northwest, we're supporting Indigenous leadership to restore and ensure healthy salmon migrations for generations to come. Learn more at nature.org/Columbia Basin. To learn more about salmon recovery in the Columbia Basin, I reached out to Sammy's colleague, Jason Nuckols, to explore a landscape that's critical to salmon habitat.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, a lot with the Nature Conservancy over a few decades. My background's a terrestrial ecologist. I was trained in plant ecology and fire ecology, and I started out of graduate school working in prairies and savannas and doing that type of restoration, really, upland-based work, And over time, I think in the Pacific Northwest, you just get sucked into water pretty easily if you're not watching out. And I'm a water person. I love being in rivers and creeks and lakes and ponds and everything. And so when the opportunity came around to work on freshwater restoration, I just jumped right in.
Jason is the Estuaries and Freshwater Project Manager at TNC in Oregon. Estuaries are these liminal spaces where freshwater and seawaters meet. As water levels rise and fall with the tides, deep channels cut through grasslands and mudflats, delivering a perfect mix of nutrients for juvenile salmon. I like to call estuaries the marshy middle.
You hit the nail on the head. Marshy middle and places that are transitional and land and water at the same time. That's so true. And I think that's what drives me there, because you get a little bit of everything. I've always loved the saying that you can never step into the same river twice. And I think that same holds true for estuaries, maybe even more so. There's that daily tidal exchange where you have two highs and two lows. That makes the environment so dynamic and so extremely different. I don't think I'll ever get used to water flowing in two directions twice a day. It's just, I'll never get used to that. Yeah, like you said, the salt water goes in, fresh water comes off our coast range, it mixes with the salt water, it all heads back out to sea. The water depths in our estuaries are changing so fast within minutes. So then that translates to habitats changing as well. You can witness something like a mudflat being created almost instantly, and then within an hour, it disappears to open water again, just as you were saying. This environment, it can also be hostile at times with that huge water exchange and the wind and the waves. But if you're out there long enough and you're watching like some of our wildlife, say marine mammals like harbor seals or our shorebirds, they take it all in stride. It's like they're just going up to a buffet, with not a care in the world. And then I think there's this historical, I don't want to miss this point, the historical and cultural piece to estuaries as well, because estuaries were the settling grounds for people throughout history. This is where we went because they provided abundant food and transportation. So they're some of the oldest cultural places on Earth, too.
There's this term that comes up when you get into talking about estuaries, especially in relationship to how they can facilitate salmon migrations. And it is this term, salmon meta-nursery. And for anybody like me who doesn't normally speak like that, I just have to pause and ask you, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't think the majority of people know, and it's a fairly new term too. So don't count that against yourself. Well, our estuaries are truly the nurseries. They're nurseries for our oceans and where our rivers come together. That mixing of the fresh and the salt water, it creates that nutrient-rich environment, and it supports so much plant and animal life. It's in our estuaries that these juvenile salmon can slow down, rest, feed, and grow larger before going out to the ocean. And the reason that's important is that we know that we lose the majority of our young salmon in those first few weeks when they go out to the ocean. And so you think about it, if the juvenile fish leaves our rivers and our estuaries and they're larger and healthier, they have a higher chance of surviving and then returning as adults. And then that term meta-nurseries is a really recent term. It's being used to describe how juvenile salmon are using multiple nurseries, not just their natal stream, that stream that they were born into. So this is a great, I guess, example of how we're still learning about salmon migrations. I don't know if you remember this, or maybe you were taught that simple salmon circle of life diagram. It's, the circle, the salmon are born into the headwaters of the streams. They migrate out to the sea. They spend a few years in the ocean, and then they come back as adults.
Right.
Real simple. It's too simple. In reality, some of these salmon are exhibiting life histories and migratory patterns that are much, much more complex. They're going in and out. They're coming back. They're popping into different nurseries, different freshwater habitats, so that they can grow and rest and things like that. So we're kind of blowing that salmon circle of life apart right now. And this matters because these meta-nurseries are providing more places for salmon to utilize and more life histories for these species. That bolsters the populations and it makes them more resilient to changing conditions. So it's a new concept, and it's changing the way we think.
Wow. So the idea sounds like in these meta-nurseries, we've kind of expanded the way that we think about where salmon go in order to thrive and survive and complete their life history. And so what I'm hearing from you is that estuaries are becoming integrated into that conversation. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. A lot of people will say that juvenile stage and that rearing in our estuaries and that habitat type, the tidal wetlands of our estuaries, are the limiting bottleneck for our salmon in many places. So the more work we do, the more effort we put into connecting those places and making for healthy estuaries, the better we're going to do for juvenile fish and therefore, like I said, returning adults. Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested in this part you were talking about, where estuaries are sometimes the bottleneck to a healthy life history. So can you break that down for me?
Yeah. Well, like I said, going back to that point that I was mentioning about this, estuaries are where people settled throughout time along our coast because of access to food, access to water, access to transportation. They're also some of our most endangered systems now, or the systems that have been manipulated the most. So in those tidal wetlands, to make them even better for people, working landscapes and towns and railroads, and we did a lot of draining and a lot of transitioning from a healthy tidal system to a levied or diked and a drained system. So the majority of our estuaries are not only privately held by people, but they're also being used for a lot of different purposes right now. So there's a lot of competing interests. And when we dike and we drain and we levy the estuaries, we're just cutting off that access to juvenile fish. And so what we're trying to do is to open up some of those areas, reconnect the tidal floodplain and the tidal wetlands back to the rivers so that fish have access. So we spend a lot of time on fish passage, connectivity, and adding that complexity back into the estuaries. And the fish respond really well when it happens.
Jason tells me his work to restore coastal wetlands has paid off. Just this year, juvenile salmon born in their natal streams in southern Oregon were tagged. He and his team found these fish access recently restored coastal estuaries as they migrated to and from the ocean. Without these restoration efforts, the water in the estuaries would not have been available previously.
It's just amazing that, the impact of the work in an estuary on the southern Oregon coast benefits fish inland and up the Columbia Basin hundreds and hundreds of miles away. That was really game-changing. It tells me that our work conserving and restoring estuaries is larger than we realized, and it makes you feel really, really good that the impact is not only local, but it's benefiting those fishes and wildlife that are, in places we have yet to identify.
Now my exploration of salmon migrations leads me to a place where salmon populations are unlike anywhere else in the world. In Bristol Bay, Alaska, summer salmon runs see tens of millions of fish returning to the rivers and streams where they were born. The bay's certified sustainable commercial fishery boasts a $2.2 billion industry where half the world's wild salmon are harvested, feeding people around the globe. I reached out to my friend Katie Moore, Bristol Bay Conservation Coordinator for TNC in Alaska, to learn more. Katie grew up in the Bay, steeped in her family's Yupik fishing and harvesting traditions. She earned a degree in environmental studies from Fort Lewis College and has worked at the intersection of land care and community care throughout her career. At TNC, she facilitates the exchange of traditional ecological knowledge between local Indigenous communities and conservationists, always rooted in kindness and reciprocity.
So in 2025, this past summer, we had almost 50 to a little over 51 million salmon return to the watershed. I am from the Nuckols River, and in the Nuckols River, we saw about 15 million salmon return to that watershed. Now, the Nuckols River is home to a lot of communities. It's about 280 miles long, but that run is the whole town, the whole region comes alive in the summertime. It seems a little quiet in the winter and everyone's kind of tucked in because it's really cold. But in the summertime, that whole place just comes alive and you can feel the energy. The town is buzzing and you get off the plane and people are just excited. And we see an influx of thousands of people in the summer. I think in Dillingham specifically during the winter, we have about 2,500 people there. But in the summertime, it jumps to 7,000 to 9,000.
Wow.
That's just from fishermen and people that are working in the canneries and on tenders. I can't describe the feeling of seeing your net be full other than just satisfaction. You're going to make some money to take home for the winter, or that your freezer is going to be full. It's a really beautiful sight to see, and to know that this salmon run is still thriving and still producing sockeye salmon numbers in the same way that it has for thousands of years.
I know that you work in an area called Bristol Bay, and I don't know much about that place at all. Would you take a moment and just describe what it is and what it represents to you?
Yes, absolutely. Bristol Bay is in Alaska, and it's a really large geographical region. I think people say it's relative to the size of the state of Ohio.
Hmm.
We have 31 federally recognized tribes who call this place home. And I think there are around 30 communities here with over 7,000 year-round residents. And that's a very large area with a relatively few number of people. Despite that, the indigenous cultures that have lived on this land have stewarded this place since time immemorial. And Bristol Bay, to me, is just home, is just that.
So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about what it's like to come from a place that really orients itself around seasons and specifically those moments where salmon are doing different things in the waterways.
Yeah. So salmon in Alaska, but especially in Bristol Bay, they are a keystone species. In the summertime, when they return to our rivers from the ocean, they bring a lot of nutrients with them. And, you can find salmon DNA in trees. They support entire food webs and cultures and communities. You can find salmon DNA in like the tiniest microorganisms to a 900-pound grizzly bear. And my people, Yupik people, we're here because of that relationship to the salmon. They not only feed us, but they teach us respect and about not over harvesting, the value of sharing, and about reciprocity. Beyond harvesting, salmon are also the lifeblood of the communities in Bristol Bay. Our local economies are extremely dependent on them and would not be there without the commercial fishing industry. Beyond that, though, they do help to strengthen our community bonds, from sharing your catch, your subsistence catch, with elders who maybe aren't able to fish anymore themselves, or just to spend time with family and process fish together. One of my favorite things to do in the summertime is hang out with my mom, and I think I was 18 and I hung her a net. So I put all the cork line and the lead line together, and I made her this net, which she doesn't use anymore because she's an elder herself now, and she would say that, so that's why I'm an elder. But yeah, now we just process fish together, and my dad will bring her, like 100 sockeye, and we put on some music and we just have a good time. And I think that time spent doing physical labor for food that is going to last her throughout the winter really connects us, but it also connects us to these beings that gave their life to feed us. Mm-hmm. And when you feed your family that way, and when you feed yourself that way, there's this respect that you can't help but to feel, because when you buy meat from a grocery store, it's easy to feel very disconnected from the animal that gave its life. But you're going from either receiving fish that someone caught, or you're going out and catching the fish yourself, and then you're transporting it home and you're processing it and putting it away and taking time to do that, you really get a sense of all the work that goes into feeding yourself and feeding your community.
Katie tells me abundant salmon runs in Bristol Bay bring a lot of attention. Environmental nonprofits, researchers, and the mining industry look to the area's abundant natural resources with intention to extract, siphoning stories, co-opting traditional ecological knowledge, transferring fishing permits held by families for generations, and seeking profit for outside interests. Beneath Bristol Bay's winding rivers lies one of the world's richest deposits of copper, gold, and molybdenum, with an estimated value of nearly $500 billion. Katie says extractive and transactional relationships with outside organizations have resulted in broken trust.
Historically, when an environmental nonprofit or organization or just a research entity comes into Bristol Bay, but Alaska Native communities, they come in with a goal in mind, with no care for what the community would like to see, and often no care for the community, period. There have been research entities that come into place and have absolutely no interaction with the tribes and peoples of the lands that they are on and who own those lands. They come in, take some data, take whatever they need, and then leave without any recognition of those that live there. And sometimes they're even crossing like legal boundaries of people's own property.
The Nature Conservancy is committed to taking a different approach by incorporating Indigenous knowledge to its conservation priorities while considering the long-term impact on the local community.
So something that I think TNC has been very mindful of is wanting to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into their work. And I think that they've made steps in the right direction to ensure that that not only happens, but that it's done in a good way. We're either compensating our knowledge holders fairly, or we're seating them at the table to drive the changes that they would like to see. I feel that is the only way to do that work in a good way.
Support comes from the Nature Conservancy. In Alaska's Bristol Bay, we're working with local and Indigenous communities to protect the world's most important wild salmon nursery. Learn more at nature.org/Bristol Bay.
You know, I think it'd be lost on me if I didn't ask you, what is it that these outside people or organizations are flocking to Bristol Bay or other communities in Alaska to see or witness or learn?
I mean, a lot of times it is salmon. And I guess maybe for outside of Bristol Bay, it's just to see this environment that is pristine. I won't say untouched, because the Indigenous stewards of that land have cared for it, and that's why it is the way that it is. But these places that are largely pristine and extremely healthy. And I think that for Bristol Bay, a large part of that is the salmon run that happens every year. And we felt the effects of that.
Katie's work in the Bay focuses on rebuilding broken trust after this history of extractive research and conservation. She helps local communities plan for a sustainable future that benefits the local economy. Under her facilitation, the communities work through a strategy called lateral kindness, a trauma-informed response to lateral violence. Lateral violence is a specific type of conflict experienced between community members and is sometimes referred to as violence against your own. To understand this term, I sought information from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. They define lateral violence as aggressive or damaging actions between individuals within oppressed societies. It's often a sure sign of intergenerational trauma and a competition for resources that can impact mental, emotional, and physical health and destroy the important process of transferring traditional knowledge and culture within an Indigenous community. On the flip side, lateral kindness work strengthens kinship by acknowledging the true sources of a community's issues. And it works to break down internalized oppression while restoring traditional practice as a means to heal. Katie tells me her primary aspiration at TNC is to work with Indigenous partners in the Bay, advocating for their basic needs to be met and their community bonds to remain intact. She believes conservation can't only be about protecting the world's last healthy salmon runs or preserving tundra ecosystems. But conservation must also take a local community's well-being into account.
They know that there is change happening and that there is a need for either current systems to change or policy to change. I am Yupik myself. I have some of this that I need to work through, and it becomes very personal at that point. And it means that if I want my communities to share these conversations, it means I need to be a part of these conversations as well. And I need to be self-aware, and I need to do my own healing work to be able to say, like, hey guys, it gets better, you know? And it's really hard at first, and it's really hard to be open and kind of get raw and vulnerable. But I think the more that we can share that with our communities and say, like, it's okay to feel angry, it's okay to feel sad. I think that that is what will begin to heal with our community without outside eyes prying in, even if it may be facilitated or supported by an outside organization. You know, organizations like TNC, they can't do this work alone. The help of the local stewards of these places that we're working in and the relationships with those people are essential in making sure this shared vision is a success. And to advocate for our lands and waters, the stewards of that land, the community members, they need to come together with a unified voice. In Alaska, in our rural communities, we need access to mental health resources, food security, housing, jobs, an economic safety net. And when you're working in these places, you can't look very far into an issue without realizing how interwoven it is into web of other inequities. You know, climate change is changing our landscape. It's making hunting harder. That leads to food insecurity, which leads to people buying processed foods that are extremely highly priced grocery stores. And people end up buying the cheapest foods they can because healthy foods are too expensive. And that leads to a rise in health issues, which leads to a rise in mental health issues. You know, if your physical being isn't well, your mental state is going to follow or can. And it leads to a host of other things that our communities are facing every single day. Yet still, we're asked to come to the table and share our knowledge about stewarding a place. And we still do. And I think when we start to look at these things in conservation specifically more holistically, and when we heal wounds that divide us and we invest in relationships, we can find a shared purpose. And when we invest in our lands and waters, we are also investing in ourselves because they're inseparable from our identity as Indigenous people. And conservation in Indigenous communities is not just ecological, it's cultural, it is spiritual, it is communal. And that is why I fully believe that healing work is a strategy in conservation, and it's not just an outcome. I think it is a driver, and it's foundational for long-term stewardship.
Thanks for listening to this special episode of On the Move, a podcast mini-series about wild animals, their amazing migrations, and how people are finding ways to free them up from all the things standing in their way. In the next episode, we take flight, following long-distance flyers from Alaska to Chile on the Pacific Flyway. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Sammy Matsaw Jr., Jason Nuckols, and Katie Moore for sharing their knowledge and passion for salmon migrations and the communities that support them. And thanks to my storytelling team, the brilliant minds behind every episode of On the Move. This episode was written and produced by me, Leah Palmer, with support from Kate O'Neill and Dustin Solberg. Custom artwork was created by Erica Simek-Sloniker with support from Mitch Maxson. Web and social production come from Danielle Kagen and Traci Swift. Find more from this series at nature.org/onthemove.